John Task, John Taylor, Marjorie Taylor, Thomas Mitchell, Bessie Thomason, Bessie Thompson, Isabel Thompson, Elspeth Todd, Janet Tawdry, Agnes Torrey, Janet Toys, Helen Trotter, Marley Turnbull, Marion Twiddy, Christian Valange, Agnes Nickeen Vane, Margaret Neil Vane, Christian Neen Farker Vick, Nicol Waddy, Janet Walker, Janet Wast, Bessie Watson, Janet Watson, Agnes Walsh, James Welsh, Helen Wenton, Helen White, Agnes Williamson, Bessie Wilson, Christine Wilson, Helen Wilson, Janet Wilson, Robert Wilson, Margaret Wilson, Margaret Wishart, Marion Wood, Janet White, Christian Wiley, Margaret Wiley, Bessie Young, Christian Young, Elspeth Young, John Young, Janet Young, Margaret Young, Bessie Young, unknown midmost son of Sawley McAllister, unknown mother of Robertson, unknown wife of Alexander Aitken, unknown wife of Archibald Baird, unknown wife of Alexander Bell, unknown wife of Thomas Bailey, unknown goddaughter of T. Finlayson, unknown wife of Thomas Finlayson, unknown wife of William Finlayson, unknown wife of Thomas Hay, unknown wife of Archibald Manners, unknown wife of Pippa, unknown wife of George Sandy, unknown wife of Sawley McAlexander, unknown daughter of Alexander McElmartin, unknown eldest son of Catherine Moore, unknown wife of Richard Gulvitas, unknown wife of George Sandy, unknown wife of Alexander Bell, unknown daughter of Black Hugh Stewart, unknown McCullum Begg, unknown Mirrlees, unknown Robusness, unknown McCarrish, Bessie D, unknown Goodfellow, unknown Neving, Mr. Unknown Pippa, unknown Nisbet, Kylie Unknown, unknown McElmartin, unknown Stewart, unknown Brand, unknown Gray, unknown McLeaven, unknown McNeil, unnamed persons, unknown, 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 unknown witches, unknown, 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 Witch Bandon, Isabel Elder, Adam Gillies, Jonet Neen Ghibli Gow, Jonet Patton, Mary Rind, Isabel Simpson, Christian Watson, unknown Gillies, several persons, Helen Alexander, Elizabeth Bruce, Janet Burness, Barbara Drummond, Margaret Guthrie, Margaret Thompson, unknown, Catherine Manson, unknown, Grisel Anderson, Agnes Brown, Margaret Cowie, Margaret Dobby, Elspeth Guild, Margaret Guthrie, Margaret Horn, Janet Howard, Christian May, Barbara Drummond, Janet Finney, Isabel Key, Witchcraft Cases, Margaret Abernethy, Mary Nian Innesvik Cool, Margaret Dury, Grisel Jaffrey, More Nain Du McIvers, More Roy, Robert Chevies, Isabel Spence, Margaret Neil Vane, Henry Wilson, unknown several persons, certain persons, James Anderson, Janet Anderson, Christian Brake, Janet Conaghy, Marion Caskey, Margaret Cool, Meggie Cowie, Mary Mann Innes, Jean Laying, James McPhee, Jean Weir, Major Thomas Weir, unknown Goodall, William Bannerman, James Beverley, Gillis Burnett, Christian Ketchy, John Crisby, Elspeth Deason, Margaret Dury, Margaret Fleming, Christian Ford, Helen George, Alex Grant, Grisel Grott, George Gislett, Jonet Howitt, Margaret Jonking, Andrew Laidlaw, Janet Lyon, Janet Miller, Marion McCall, Grisel McClenny, Janet McMuldritchy, Janet McMurdoch, Bessie Payne, Ishbel Robinson, Jean Ross, Catherine Russell, Jean Ruthard, Mary Somerville, Elspeth Thompson, Elspeth Thompson, Elspeth Wood, Janet Howitt, Christian Morrison, Margaret McGuffock, Ishbel Payne, Grisel Ray, Elspeth Smith, Agnes Mornin, Vicky Anglish, unknown, 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 unknown. Alison Angus, Margaret Bigland, Janet Harlow, Janet McNichol, Mary McThomas, Mulfrey Porteous, Suna Vaux, unknown Bessie. Unknown daughter of Mulfrey Porteous, Margaret Clark, Gideon Penman, Janet Drever. Agnes Mornin, Vic English, Agnes Hendry, Janet Hendry, Janet Hendrys, Elspeth Hutton. Ishbel Inglis, Margaret Nicholson, Gillies Robertson, Catherine Sands, unknown, unknown. Isabel Davidson, John McGregor, Janet Craig, Marjorie Craig, Andrew Curry, Christian Donald, Margaret Douglas, John Gray, Margaret Jackson, Margaret Kirkwood, Ishbel Lang, Janet Matthey, Janet Munn, Mary Mitchell, Thomas Mitchell, Elizabeth Moody, John McGregor, Donald Michael, Janet McNair, Lizzie Moody, Janet Munn, Margaret Patterson, Marion Finn, Annabel Stewart, John Stewart, Bessie Weir, Margaret Wright, Margaret Anderson, Marjorie Anderson, Margaret Bannatyne, Bessie Bell, Ishbel Borthwick, Janet Borthwick, Janet Burton, James Campbell, Marion Campbell, Margaret Cooper, Sarah Cranston, Agnes Dalglish, Margaret Dalglish, Margaret Dodds, Margaret Douglas, Bessie Elliott, Isabel Elliott, Helen Forster, Bessie Gourley, Catherine Halliday, Janet Henryson, Christian Hogger, Barbara Howden, Andrew Hood, Janet Hunter, Agnes Kelly, Elspeth Knox, Margaret Lane, Helen Lang, Margaret Lewis, Catherine Liddell, Margaret Liddell, Margaret Lewis, Janet Maitland, Gideon Penman, Alison Ray, Margaret Russell, Isabel Shantz, Isabel Shank, Margaret Small, Agnes Somerville, Margaret Sons, Agnes Thompson, Margaret Thompson, Barbara Veitch, Marion Veitch, Grizzle Walker, Margaret Williamson, Elizabeth Wood, Margaret White, Janet Wilson, unknown wife of Walter Spence, unknown henwife, unknown, John Alexander, Walter Anderson, Agnes Armstrong, Bessie Burke, Elspeth Chowsley, John Colquhoun, William Craw, John Crosby, Grizzle Crowdy, Janet Christie, Adam Donaldson, Janet Douglas, Jean Flodden, Margaret Fleming, Isabel Gottison, Anna Gray, Richard Halliwell, Margaret Hamilton, Giles Harley, Eupham Harther, Helen Herkiston, Margaret Hewitt, Janet Hill, Ishbel Hislop, John Hislop, Marion Hislop, Marion Hopkirk, Janet Howitt, Janet Hunter, Margaret Kincaid, Margaret Law, Christian Lockhart, Marge Logan, Margaret McGuffock, Gideon Penman, Margaret Pringle, Grizzle Ray, Bessie Ramsey, Marion Robertson, Ishbel Robson, James Russell, Jean Rutherford, John Scott, Catherine Smith, James Stewart, Jonet Stewart, William Stewart, Anapi Thompson, Helen Trotton, Bessie Vicker, Elspeth Watson, Margaret Whiteman, Bessie Woodside, Elspeth Wood, Margaret Wood, Eupham Wright, unknown Janet, unknown wife of Walter Anderson, unknown mother of William Allen, unknown mother of David Johnson, Margaret Coombe, Nicholas Buchanan, Bessie Gibb, Elizabeth Hutchison, Ishbel McClartich, Anne MacArthur, Elizabeth Scotland, Margaret White, Agnes Stewart, and Nin Williams, Elspeth Kirkland, Janet Robertson, Margaret Dougal, Margaret Douglas, John Black, Thomas Boyd, Janet Brown, Janet Fisher, Joan Graham, Jean Grey, Elizabeth Hewsworth, Isabel Hislop, John Hislop, Marion Hislop, Margaret Logan, Janet Losk, Catherine Lorimer, Elizabeth Naismith, Marion McRae, Ishbel Reed, Margaret Wilkin, Helen Wilson, Unknown Hopkin, Helen Elliott, John McQueen, Marion Purdy, Catherine McTaggart, William Eason, Janet Fraser, William Simpson, Isabel Dixon, Marion Herbertson, Sarah Smith, unknown, 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 John Dougal, unknown McQuicken, unknown McCrory, unknown, Janet Widrow, several persons, Alexander Anderson, Elizabeth Anderson, Jean Anderson, Catherine Campbell, Agnes Chisholm, Margaret Cunningham, Agnes Dess, Margaret Ewing, Catherine Flowers, Angus Forrester, Margaret Fulton, Thomas Govan, Ishbel Lachlan, Margaret Lang, James Lindsay, John Lindsay, Thomas Lindsay, William Miller, Donald Moyer, Margaret McKillop, Agnes Naismith, John Patterson, John Reed, Janet Rogers, Margaret Rogers, Martha Semple, Margaret Shearer, John Stewart, Agnes Urich, Janet Waugh, Janet Worry, Elspeth Wood. Unknown people, several witches, several persons, several warlocks, John Glass, Jean Hart, Margaret Laird, Marion Lilly, Mary Miller, Elspeth McEwen, Elspeth McGowan, Alison Nisbet, Margaret Polwart, several witches, Elizabeth Anderson, Marion Bartleman, Margaret Bezac, Janet Boyd, Isabel Cochrane, Agnes Desk, Jean Ewing, Jean Greenlaw, Christian Gillash, John Glass, Mary Graugy, Jean Hadron, Isabel Henderson, James Jock, Mary Keel, William Kelly, Janet Kennedy, Janet Kennick, Janet Lindsay, Ishbel Mathy, Marion Mathy, Bessie Miller, Barbara Munro, Margaret Munro, Mary McKinney, Donald McCulkey, Nick Nanrick, Margaret Provost, Barbara Rasser, John Robertson, Janet Scott, Eric Sheen, Agnes Supp, Margaret Supp, Janet Temple, Margaret Temple, Helen Thompson, Jean Humphrey, Janet Worry, Elspeth Wilson, Elspeth Wood, Agnes Rath, Margaret White, Jean Whitehill, several warlocks, several witches, Unknown Bell, Margaret Alexander, Janet Boyd, Janet Woodrow, Bessie Cochrane, John Dougal, Jean Drummond, Margaret Duncan, Janet Gentleman, Margaret Gentleman, Jean Gilmore, John Glass, Anna Hill, Ishbel Houston, Ellen King, Janet Lang, Meg Lawson, Bessie Little, Alexander Lyle, Mary Morrison, John Patterson, Annabel Reed, Janet Robertson, Jean Ross, Anne Snip, Elspeth Tarbert, Barbara Tulloch, Marion Ear, Margaret Watson, Jean Woodrow, Elizabeth Dick, Janet McRobert, Jean McRobert, Margaret Miles, Molly Redmond, Unknown Lady Tondagee, Grizzle Anderson, Euphan Sturt, Janet McMurray, Robert Blainsey, Isabel Adam, Lilias Adie, Jean Bizet, Bessie Callender, Mary McCarmichael, Janet Comfort, Agnes Curry, Janet Horsburgh, Margaret Jack, Lilias Wallace, Margaret Wallace, Mrs. White, Janet White, Elspeth Williamson, Mary Wilson, Anna Wood, Unknown White, Thomas Brown, Janet Cornfoot, Bessie Heslop, Beatrix Lane, Nicholas Lawson, Mary McNairn, Mary Stewart, Jean Brown, Helen Kirkpatrick, John McNairn, George Rattray, Lachlan Rattray, Alexander Dewart, Janet McKinona, Adam Black, Agnes Curry, Adam Black, Janet Dugan, Nicholas Lawson, Andrew Ratter, Elizabeth Ratter, Catherine Taylor, Margaret Watson, Christian Wilkinson, Ishbel Adam, Margaret Clark, Marian Brown, James Davidson, Janet Hairstains, Betty Lang, Nicholas Lawson, Elspeth Rule, Janet Watt, Elspeth Wood, Henry Christian, Anne Sutherland, Isabel Anderson, Sarah Johnson, Margaret Ogilvy, Helen Andrew, Margaret McCallum, Margaret Lynn Gilbert, Margaret Oyson, Janet Piper, unknown Mr. Houston, Margaret Drummond, Margaret Bain, Margaret Watson, Janet Horn, unknown Horn, several persons, John Mill, the curate of Anstruther, Patrick Adamson, Janet Baker, Margaret Balfour, Lilias Barry, Scotta Bess, Christian Bonn, Isabel Darcy, Christian Dote, Bournley Flens, John Gordon, Margaret Hay, Janet Henderson, May Hopkin, Gidachreen McAllister, Elizabeth McEwen, Margaret Magfate, Margaret Merton, Margaret Reed, Archbishop Sharp, Catherine Shaw, Helen Stewart, Marion Taylor, James Woodrow, unknown Bournley, unknown Sharp, unknown, 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 unknown.